Hello, welcome to Feck TV. This is the first of our live current affairs programme. Tonight I'm joined by two guests. I've got Noel Burn and I've got David O'Brien from the Centre for Asian Studies at University College Cork. Now, tonight we're going to be talking about China, and we're going to be looking a little bit about where China's come from, where they are now, and China in the future. So I'm going to start off, I suppose, the discussion tonight, David and Noel, really by asking a question. Sort of 20 years ago, China was an extremely different place than it is now. There was no social media that we're seeing today. Many of the skyscrapers we sort of take for granted weren't fully built or finished, and it was perhaps not the economic wonder that we see today. In terms of that period, David, could you tell us a little bit more about where China came from? And I know sort of 1978 is a big number there.
Well, the last 100 years in China are probably one of the most extraordinary centuries any country has witnessed. They went from the start of the century, the fall of the empire, 2,000-year empire. They went straight into an occupation. Japanese occupied them. They had a civil war. They had the communists coming to power. They had probably the worst famine the world has ever seen in the 1950s. They went from that into the Cultural Revolution, and from that they went into this dramatic reform in 1978. So it was coming from a position of chaos and of complete turmoil and of nothing really being as it seems and nothing being lasting for very long. In fact, the last 20, 30 years have been the most stable period in Chinese history in well over 200 years. So the key thing about now is stability. Economic stability, but also political stability. And where they are now, as their economy is growing and developing at this astonishing pace, it also has to be remembered that stability is what they're really wishing to achieve, coming from where they've come in the last 100 years. It's
an interesting thing to look at sort of China over that whole period, and see it sort of in terms really of the Industrial Revolution that, say, Britain had in sort of the 18th and 19th centuries, but in very much faster motion. It's been a huge burst of speed in this, and obviously I think a question that I wanted to ask was, in terms of this economic revolution, in terms of the industrial revolution that China's had, there's been a lot of, we've had environmental destruction, we've had displacement of people, we've had aggressive expansion. Do the people in China view that period as sort of a necessary evil, you have to break a few eggs to make an omelette type of thing, or is there still a resentment over the pace of change?
It's a very good comparison, and there's a lot of similarities between the Industrial Revolution in Britain. As you say, it's probably happened all that much quicker in China, but with that has come a lot of similar things that we saw in Britain: environmental problems, excuse me, social problems. As to whether or not it's regarded as you need to break a few eggs, I mean, Chinese people are extraordinarily pragmatic, and
actually, I have a lovely quote for that, which I think was from Deng Xiaoping, who said, "Who cares if a cat is black or white as long as it catches the mice?"
As long as it catches the mice.
Yeah, which is a fantastic quote to sort of sum that up.
And it's very much what they're doing now. They're catching mice. Is it a communist country? Is it a socialist country? Is it an authoritarian country? All of these things are debatable. What's not debatable, what everyone can agree on, is that it is catching the mice.
Oh, absolutely.
I was just wondering, it's progressed so much in the last 30 years, and groups like the World Bank are saying that it'll be the largest economy by 2030. Well, at the same time, some critics are saying China lacks an innovative spark to keep it going, to keep her lit, as it were. Would you agree with that, or do you think?
No, I don't agree with that. I think this is the country that invented paper, that invented writing systems as we know it, that invented gunpowder, that back in the 1700s was traveling the world. It had the most astonishing navy. It was a very outward-looking country. That all changed after the 19th century, and it became a very inward-looking country. And with that, maybe came some of the ideas of innovative thinking were affected by that. But now that it's re-emerged onto the world scene and is opening its doors again, I think we will see much more inventive Chinese development.
Do you think then in that case that we're going to see, you know, in let's say the next 10, 20 years, are we going to see a Chinese Apple, for instance? Are we going to see China push further, I suppose, into the luxury market? You know, Rolls-Royce, that type, you know, Prada bags even, for instance, not just the copying of them, but actually bringing out a brand that people over in Europe, in the fashion centres of, you know, Paris, for instance, are thinking, actually, I want to buy Chinese.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Can you name a Chinese company? Name a prominent Chinese company. It's very, very difficult. Probably the most well-known is Huawei, who make the little dongles for the internet connection for laptops. They're becoming a better-known company. But in terms of other companies, it's very hard to name them. Now, brands are everything in China at the moment. You've got a middle class which has developed over the past 15 years. You've got a middle class with 250 million people, and they are very keen on brands, but brands mean foreign brands, foreign luxury brands. In China, a Chinese brand is seen as second best. Will it develop that these Chinese brands will become the equal to or to be seen as better than Prada, better than Apple? Maybe. It's very hard to say.
Do you think it's a case of the Chinese brands will have to emerge first, we'll say, in the Western world, for we'll say Chinese people to go, oh, they're a big brand now, and then for themselves to take it on board?
I think so. I mean, China, the Chinese people, and all of us to an extent, the Irish are certainly the case, are maybe obsessed with how the world sees them. And the Olympics in 2008 was all about, let's show the world what we've done, what we've achieved. Look at this. We're going to put the best show anyone has ever seen. And we're going to do it, and everyone's going to think we're fantastic. There's something similar to that. If they could get their products out there and have people say, this is actually the best one in the world, then they'll come back and they'll buy it.
Then we'll really see it.
Yeah.
I just want to say to the people out watching there, please feel free to tweet in, to Facebook messages as we're going along. We'll take your questions, we'll incorporate them in. One of the things I want to look at now is, I suppose, there's no doubt that today China is an economic powerhouse. There's absolutely no point debating it. Growth rates of 10% for the last 30 years, etc. What I'd like to look at really is, I suppose, over the last sort of, let's say, 10 years, 5 to 10 years, there's been a huge growth in the wealth of the middle class. There's been a growth of that class itself. And I'd like to look at really at the sort of the changing demographics of the country and see, really, we've had now, in the last few years, things that I would say that would be almost unprecedented, even this week, in terms of protests, in terms of the journalists' strike that's going on now, at the moment, as we speak, and sort of arguments over corruption. There was the murder trial that went on in the news. And what I'd like to know is this middle class, the burgeoning middle class, pushing, I suppose, a social agenda for change a lot more than we've seen, for a long, long time in China?
Well, it's such a cliche to say that China's gone through a massive transition, but like every cliche, it's true. I mean, when I first went to China, I first started going to China in 2002, but 80% of the Chinese population lived in the countryside. This year, it went over 50%. Living in cities, so it's
huge shift,
largest migratory urbanization
and do you see
we've
that,
ever seen.
And do you see that continuing to rise?
The government hope it will, because that's what a lot of their.
I suppose that's where the money is.
That's where the money is. They want people to move into the cities. They want people to buy property in the cities. They want people to buy apartments to live in them. They want to drag people away from the more remote regions, which are not entirely fully under their control, such as Tibet and Xinjiang, and want more people to engage as producers and become consumers.
I suppose, though, with that, then you've got the increase in education, you've got the increase in wealth, and then it turns round into a greater ability, I suppose, to then criticise the people who've brought them to the cities, to criticise the government.
I was going to say, with the middle class, we'll say, advancing so much, is it still fair to say that the lower class then, are they still stuck where they were, or is their standard of living improving a little?
They use the expression that everybody's boat has risen in China. But what does it actually mean? In the countryside, it means that where once people walked, then they got a bicycle, now they have a motorbike. They might have a washing machine or a fridge, which they certainly didn't have 20 years ago. But in so many other ways, their lives are very, very similar. It's a fairly basic agrarian society in the countryside. They do very much what their grandparents and great-parents did, but with maybe a little bit more.
So 6 of one, half a dozen of
Yeah.
another.
But as for the middle class and the movement of hundreds of millions of people into this middle class, and does it create for more potentially instability? Absolutely. I mean, China has, by its own figures, it had 60,000 mass incidents in 2006, and that's when they stopped releasing figures. Mass incidents are the government's term for everything from 3 or 4 people complaining about potholes in a road to very large orchestrated demonstrations against the government, and they're clearly increasing. We're seeing it all the time. You talked about that the newspaper journalists, which is extraordinary.
Absolutely.
That's a newspaper in the south of China, the Southern Weekly, which the journalists have gone on strike today because of control they feel over their editorial policy. That would not have happened in China 2 years ago. That wouldn't have happened in China last year.
Yeah. We've actually got a question come in via the Twitter sphere, as it were, from a chap called Mark over in Canada. And what he's asking is, in terms of the conversation that we've just been having, I suppose what he'd like to know is this gap between rich and poor, this inequality, is it something that the Chinese government in, let's say, the next 10 years really needs to get a handle on? That's what he wants to know. Is the inequality going to provide most of the problems for China going forward?
It's key, and it was key to Hu Jintao, the current president, who will pass on to Xi Jinping in the next couple of months. He's already
process is underway.
Yeah, the process. It's a long process, but he was the party secretary up until November. He came in and he was very much about, we need to bring along people. We need to have, we need to ensure that this gap does not develop. This is not what we're about. We need to.
Because they've got a Gini or Gini index, which is incredibly high in terms of inequality. There's unemployment in both rural and urban areas.
Yeah.
There's a lot. I suppose there's a lot adding to the powder keg, as it were, and it's whether or not that spark will happen.
Well, under Hu Jintao, he said all of this, and this is what he wanted to happen, and exactly the opposite happened. As you said, the Gini coefficient shows it. In fact, it's become a much more unequal society, much more. The level of wealth in China is quite extraordinary.
Yeah, you've got a huge amount of wealth concentrated in a very small area.
Yeah. And it's right face to face with real poverty. And the poverty in the cities is interesting because it's, people are moving, the urbanization means people are coming from the countryside, they're moving into cities. Their lives are meant to improve, but in fact they're not. They're still living in, poverty, but it's much more wretched poverty because of the comparisons. It's not so much, you're not so poor if you're living in the countryside and everyone else is poor. It's when you see the guy in the Rolls Royce, maybe you feel a little bit more. And that's something they really are very, very consciously aware of. And that's becoming more and more an emotive issue in China
so it's
today.
Something that we might see them act, and we might see a bit more trickle-down economics pushing towards, I suppose, the west of the country.
I suppose a lot of people here in Ireland, the interest for them, with the relationship with China, would be the Euro-Chinese trading hub in Athlone. A lot of people, I suppose, would see it as, it's either going to be a big deal for Ireland, it is actually something real, and a lot of people are critical of it, saying, is it merely just a kind of immediate thing where they're trying to drum up some interest, but it's not really there. Is that kind of a fair assessment of the situation?
Well, they've got planning permission, so that's something. That's whether or not the backing is there remains to be seen. It's gone a little bit quiet over the last couple of months. I'm not sure.
I seem to remember one of them was what was one of the backers, a chap who owned a few restaurants.
Well, yeah. I mean, it remains to be seen. It remains to be seen. But in terms of what China, China does look at Ireland. China has an interest in Ireland economically, and its interest is focused on Shannon, basically, Shannon Free Trade Area. And the reason for that is when China set up its first SEZ, Special Economic Zone, based in Shenzhen in the south of China, it modelled it on Shannon Free Trade Area. In fact, it was the soon-to-be new President, Xi Jinping, his father developed the Shenzhen Special Economic Zone, and he studied Shannon quite carefully. And that was one of the reasons when you might remember Xi Jinping came to Ireland a couple of months ago, and people were asking why is he here, what exactly is he doing? One of the things was he went to Shannon, and it was kind of a personal thing for him. But it was also quite significant that they looked to Ireland in a different way than maybe America looks to Ireland or Europe looks to Ireland. In America, they look at it in terms of immigrants and the misty old dancing colleens and all that kind of stuff. China actually looks to Ireland as an interesting economic story, and also one to learn from its successes, but also to learn from its mistakes. And they're quite consciously looking at what went wrong here.
A lot of mistakes.
Quite a lot.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean,
in terms of Xi Jinping as the new leader, what do we expect to see from him that's different to what's come before? What do we expect to see a new dynamism?
Well, with any of these things, it's very early stages. I mean,
of course,
Zhou Enlai said about the when he was asked, he was a former prime minister, what did he think of the French Revolution? And he famously said it was far too early to say. Well, if it's too early to talk about the French Revolution, it's certainly too early to talk about Xi Jinping. He's only been in power for a couple of weeks. One thing that seems to be significant is will have a different style than his predecessor, Hu Jintao. He's much more affable. He's
less of an automaton.
He's less of an automaton. He seems to have a more man of the people style about him. But there's no indication that any dramatic reforms are going to take place in China. There's no indication that they're going to liberalize their political system. There's no indication that anything is going to basically change. And you have to remember that to become leader in China, you have to be all things to all people. He plotted a very, very, very difficult course between all the competing different people within the party, the different cliques within the party, the different interest groups, and he got to the top, and he did that by not offending anybody. He must be a cautious, careful man. I don't think you're going to see...
Again, back to our pragmatism, I suppose.
Very
really.
pragmatic. But you know what? He could go and shock everybody, and he could stand up tomorrow morning and say, you know, we're going to have elections, which they already do, but we're going to have more general elections.
More general election. Look, Martin Jakes recently wrote a very incredibly interesting book arguing, I suppose, that the West has a China deficit, as it were. It's a very nice way of putting it. Essentially saying that we don't particularly pay enough attention to what's going on over there, and I suppose that we don't really, we see the country almost as perhaps backwards, superstitious, something that we don't need to worry about at the moment, that it's in the back of our minds, but it's, it's there. Leave it alone, kind of thing. Do you see, sort of, I suppose, in the next 10, 20 years as a time where the West, really does need to start taking heed, does need to make changes? Are we going to see Mandarin in schools? Are we going to see increased investment in China? I mean, for instance, the UK's biggest trade partner is still Ireland. It seems maddening in an age where China holds 8% of the US deficit, for instance, to exclude them.
I hope so. I think it's absolutely vital that we get Mandarin into schools. I think it's a process that's now occurring. Rory Quinn has talked about it coming into the new junior cert cycle. It is something that I think there's a strong awareness there, and my own university is very heavily involved in promoting getting language into secondary schools. It's key because everybody knows they want to go over to China and they want to make money in China, and they know how important China is, but they have no idea actually how to do it. They don't necessarily know how to engage with the Chinese. They don't necessarily know how to approach doing business culturally, socially.
Do you think that's also, I suppose, part of the way that it needs to go the other way as well? That people, I suppose, in the West have a difficulty understanding the Chinese, but I suppose the Chinese perhaps need to reach out slightly more to the West in a different way. I know they're doing it, but to go back, I suppose, to the Olympics, you see it as a technical, a wonderful technical feat. I saw it as, something that could be achieved when, there might be a gun to the back of the head of the person who gets it wrong. Well, slightly out there kind of way, but that type of, I suppose, angle on China that we see it as a threat, there's the fear there.
Well, you remember the little girl?
Yes.
You remember the little girl? She was to sing the national anthem, and she was brought along for the rehearsals, and a very senior leader of the party saw her and said, you know what, she's not cute enough. Get rid of her.
That's right, yeah.
Did it turn out, was the girl miming at the end?
The girl who did it, the very cute girl who did it, was miming to the girl who was originally meant to sing.
It was a huge scandal.
And it was a massive scandal, but it kind of, in its own way, it's only a small thing, but maybe gives an insight into some of the thinking surrounding the Olympics. But another aspect of it is the leadership in China. This is the fifth generation, what they call the fifth generation of leadership. They have all been educated in China, apart from one who was educated in North Korea. They are very much
Wonderful
from...
place for a good
they're
education.
from a very... The new generation of Chinese leaders coming, soon, will all have been educated in America. All of the Chinese power elite are sending their children to America, specifically America, and to a lesser extent Oxford and Cambridge in Britain and Australia, but specifically America. Pretty much all of the leadership's kids are now in American universities. The next generation leadership
It's going
of...
to be very interesting.
The obvious question there is why America though, as opposed to England? Have they any preference, do you think?
Ivy League.
Ivy League is partly
It's
brand.
the name,
You want
it's
to get
the
your
brand
kids
again.
into Harvard. I mean, yeah, Oxford and Cambridge will probably say, well, how come our brand isn't strong enough to compete with Harvard?
Probably should be putting more money in.
But maybe that's an argument for another day.
I suppose I'm going to just jump out on a final question. It's going to be sort of a very quick one. Looking at China going forward, looking at China's economy, do we think it's going to keep going in the leaps and bounds that it has done? One of the problems being at the moment that it's extremely export driven, that we've got rising wages which will be reducing its competitiveness at the moment. I know you were talking earlier about China needs to innovate, I suppose. In terms of your prediction, shall we say, as a man, not an economist, but certainly as someone who knows China pretty well, what's your prediction for the next 20 years?
In
In a nutshell.
4 words or less.
Its economy cannot continue to grow at the rate it's grown over the past 20 years, and they are the first to admit it. They've been trying to cool their economy for some period of time, and then 2007 happened, the world's economy went through a major crisis, and they had to roll back on everything they did and actually start to inflate it again with a massive, basically, government bailout of everything. So they've gone against everything they said they were trying to do, which would lead you to think, well, is that what's next?
China's sound like any given government.
Yeah, well, I mean, Chairman Mao himself used to say the greatest resource of China is its people. It's got 1.3 billion people, and if you can get every one of them to buy,
it's only increasing.
and it's actually that's another thing. It's demographically it's going down a little bit, but if you can get all those people out of poverty and they can all buy something, then you have the most vibrant economy in the world.
Thank you. Look, David, this was an incredibly interesting discussion. I really appreciate you coming on. That was David O'Brien from the Centre for Asian Studies at UCC. Noel Burn, again, thank you as well. And I've been Chris Bennett. Tune in again at fecktv.com. Thank you for watching.